Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Elizabeth Landau, and I'm the Director of Public Affairs at AGU. I'm thrilled to be able to introduce this panel who will discuss the positive and negative impacts of congressional oversight on science. We will leave a significant portion of time at the end for questions, so please type them into the question box throughout the presentation. So in recent years, an increasing number of scientists have found themselves involved in legal discussions about their work, their correspondence, and their public statements. To better prepare the scientific community for these challenges, AGU and the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund have put together a legal education program for the scientific community. The goal is to give scientists a primer on the legal issues they face and to update them on legal situations recently or currently making their way through the courts, which may impact them. The program includes webinars, events at AGU's fall meeting, and the ability to connect with attorneys who work on geoscience legal issues to help and provide advice. And there's a link on the screen here where you can go to watch past webinars that are part of this program. At this year's fall meeting, we're hosting 3 events in this series, and we hope that you will join us for all 3 of them. If you missed a past event, you can go back and watch it on demand using the fall meeting online platform. In addition, our panelists will share ways that you can get in touch directly with their legal team and other resources that they offer scientists. For today's event, we will hear from 2 legal experts from the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund. Lauren Kurtz, the Executive Director of CSLDF, and Augusta Wilson, a staff attorney at CSLDF. After the presentations, we'll have time for Q&A, so please remember to type your questions into the question box throughout the presentations. Thank you, Lauren and Augusta, for being here and for presenting on this really important topic. And now I'll turn over to Lauren to start the presentation.
Hi, my name is Lauren Kurtz. I'm the Executive Director of the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, and we are here to talk to you today about scientific advocacy and congressional powers. First of all, I would just like to thank AGU and the wonderful Liz Landau for having us this year. It's obviously a very different fall meeting, but hopefully we'll be able to do what we've always done at AGU, at least for the past few years, which is to coordinate with the scientific community and hopefully assuage any fears you have about legal risks that may relate to your work, and hopefully embolden you to do any sort of advocacy or activism that you would like to do. So with that, I'll just give a short intro to CSLDF. We are the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, and we were started to help individual scientists back in 2011, almost as a crowdfunding of sorts. Individual scientists unfortunately found themselves under fire, and that's an issue that has quite sadly continued. We work on a range of issues. We help scientists deal with open records lawsuits, scientific integrity complaints, defamation threats. I'll note, if you're interested in defamation, you can check out our event on the First Amendment with the ACLU. That's at December 15th at 9 a.m. Eastern. We've also helped scientists who have found themselves targeted by members of Congress as a result of their research or scientific advocacy, which is what we'll be delving into today. So even outside of the recent campaign season, Congress is an important area for science advocacy. Congressional actions can have great influence on how science is conducted. For example, the Trump administration has proposed budget cuts to scientific agencies and science grant making that were rejected by Congress. And in fact, Congress has provided increases in some situations. Scientists have also experienced trouble in Congress, sometimes related to their attempts to engage in policy advocacy, but sometimes just related to their scientific research. So our talk today is to discuss not only some of what can happen when Congress acts poorly towards science, but hopefully also inspire you to become involved with improving the state of affairs in Congress. And my colleague, Augusta Wilson, will talk later about how to protect yourself when engaged in congressional advocacy. So just a rundown of some of what has happened in Congress that is worth discussing. You may have heard about Congress's trend towards an increase in unilateral subpoena power, which means that a congressperson can issue a subpoena, which is a legal request for documents or testimony, without sign-on from anyone else in Congress. In theory, this is designed to help ensure that investigations can be done quickly and judiciously, but it can also go awry. Traditionally, the unilateral subpoena power was limited to a few committees. It was most notoriously used by Senator Joseph McCarthy, who repeatedly used his unilateral subpoena power and other tools to target those who he said were suspected communists in the 1950s. You may have heard of the McCarthy hearings. In 2015, Congress expanded the number of committees with unilateral subpoena power. This included the House Science Committee, chaired by Lamar Smith, who is the person in the foreground of this picture. Representative Smith used unilateral subpoena power to great effect. He issued dozens of them. He also expressed great skepticism in the scientific evidence for human-caused climate change, and climate science was a frequent subject of his investigations. So in 2015, for example, Lamar Smith issued a number of unilateral subpoenas related to a study that came out in Science about how ocean temperatures were rising more quickly than previous studies had indicated. Lamar Smith was of the opinion that this study was not truly scientific, that it was a politically influenced paper by the Obama administration in order to force issues at the Paris climate talks, which are happening later this year. So he did a long-ranging and quite intense investigation of the NOAA scientists involved. Nothing came of the investigation. NOAA, under the Obama administration, actually refused to comply with many aspects of the subpoenas, but it was a pretty ugly process, and I think it was quite distressing for the scientists involved, and obviously took a lot of money and time, and it was I think a real illustration of the ways that the unilateral subpoena's power can be misused when not properly controlled by other factors. That said, unilateral subpoenas are good things in many instances. Certainly both parties like to use them. After taking over the House in 2018, Democrats were very sparing in their use of the unilateral subpoena power, at least compared to the previous term, but it has definitely been used in some instances. For example, you may remember this past summer, there were a number of investigations into the Post Office, and Postmaster General Louis DeJoy. Unilateral subpoenas were used in that scenario as well. So one thing that unfortunately happens with far too much regularity, admittedly not every day, but I would still say far too often, is the targeting of individual scientists by members of Congress. So here on the left, you have Representative Joe Barton, who was a representative from Texas. And in the early 2000s, after reading a Wall Street Journal article, he came to the opinion that perhaps some federally funded research on climate change was a misuse of taxpayer funds. This particular research was the quote unquote hockey stick, which was a paper that came out in the late 90s by Michael Mann, Malcolm Hughes, and Ray Bradley. And it indicated that temperatures in the last 50 to 100 years were markedly higher than they'd been pre-industrial revolution. So Representative Barton investigated these three scientists on their research and the validity of their research, despite not being a scientist himself. He issued subpoenas for the documents. He had multi-day hearings. This was another instance where nothing much came of the research, but it was a very ugly process, again, for the scientists involved, and took up a lot of time and money and took the scientists away from their research, and I think, which is all around a really unfortunate situation. On the right side, you have Dr. Linda Birnbaum. She was a scientist at the National Institute for Environmental Health Studies, and she wrote a paper on how scientists should work with policymakers to do a better job of bringing pesticide regulations up to speed. A lot of the studies that have been done on toxicity of pesticides were done in the 1970s, and the research since then has indicated that a lot of these pesticides are actually far more harmful than the original studies had indicated. There was one sentence in particular that took the ire of Lamar Smith again, which was to say that scientists and the public and policymakers should coordinate to improve these regulations and possibly strengthen them. And Lamar Smith singled on this because he felt that this was a violation of anti-lobbying laws. In particular, Linda Birnbaum, as a federal employee, is prohibited from instigating any sort of quote unquote grassroots campaigns, which again, my colleague Augusta will talk about more in a moment. Lawyers and experts in this agreed that this did not rise to the level of grassroots lobbying. And again, an investigation that didn't go anywhere, but I think illustrates just how this can be used and how difficult this can be for the scientists who find themselves under fire. Again, though, this is not something that just Republicans have done. This has been done by both Republicans and Democrats. So here we have Arul Grijalva, who is a representative from Arizona. And back in 2015, there was a New York Times article that came out that exposed financial links between fossil fuel companies and scientists who disputed mainstream climate science. Representative Grijalva attempted to gain information about the funding sources of 7 researchers who had taken prominent and contrarian positions. He sent letters demanding information about their funding sources, as well as records related to the preparation of public testimony for these outspoken quote unquote climate skeptics. Public reaction criticized the requests for records related to preparation of the public testimony, as these records could consist of frank debate and candid discussion, which when you take that out of context, would potentially have a chilling effect on other scientific debate. I mean, in general, CSLDF has taken the position that we really shouldn't be asking for internal communications where people are batting around ideas or debating concepts, because we want to encourage people to be free flowing in their exchange of information and ideas. And we want to encourage scientists to be able to do things like take devil's advocate positions and, criticize each other's positions, to be able to really toss around some potentially wacky ideas just in the furtherance of science and really exploring all possibilities. So I do agree that asking for that sort of information, in the absence of actual wrongdoing, is something that we should truly shy away from doing. And Grijalva ultimately retracted a request for the correspondence. He also asked for financial information. I think that's a much more appropriate request. And again, an investigation where the yield from this is unclear. I think a lot of these investigations actually just amount to grandstanding, regardless of party. But I think this is an important distinction to show. There are certain requests that are very valid, and there are other requests that I think are just more harmful than helpful. As noted before, hearings I think sometimes are more show than substance. So this is an example here of Lamar Smith again. He had a disproportionate focus on industry researchers. He often featured a high number of climate criterions. His hearings traditionally far outnumbered, actually, the attendance at his hearings, or the participants in his hearings, often were heavily industry focused, far outnumbered the number of mainstream climate scientists involved. It's a real shame that we don't have better framings around these, and to how scientists can do a better job of actually being represented on these hearings to reflect actual science and not just industry funded think tank folks. And that's something I would love to see the next Congress do a better job of doing. Again, my colleague Augusta will talk a little bit more about how scientists can be more involved in coordinating and communicating with Congress. But, there's still, I think, some signs that we have not shed a lot of these anti-science ways. In the 117th Congress, which has not started yet, will come into office in January 2021. We're still awaiting to see what happens with certain things, such as the outcome of some Senate races to happen in Georgia next month. But there are some clear outcomes that we know how they turned out. Senator James Inhofe, who is a pretty well-known, self-described climate contrarian, he won re-election this year in 2020 at age 86. He is perhaps most famous for bringing a snowball into the floor of the Senate in 2015. He claimed continuing cold weather in DC showed that climate change was an overblown concept. Less famously, but more damagingly, in the wake of ClimateGate in 2011 or so, he threatened 17 scientists with a potential criminal investigation, saying that he saw that their emails related to this hack that happened out of the University of East Anglia. He found a few sentences here and there that in his mind, suggested malfeasance and intimidated or tried to intimidate these scientists into believing that a criminal investigation was forthcoming. It wasn't, it didn't happen, but another instance of, I think, a distressing use of or abuse of congressional powers. And then on the right, we have Darrell Issa. He did not run in 2018. He's a congressperson who has been in office for a number of years, except for the previous term. He was supposed to take a job in the Trump administration. It didn't pan out. He ran again in 2020 and won. During his earlier time in Congress, he issued over 100 subpoenas, which was a truly record-breaking number. Historically, his subpoenas are more interested in the Obama administration's handling of the Benghazi terrorist attacks in Libya and whether the IRS was unfair to conservative groups. But unfortunately, he's also made statements over the years questioning the science surrounding climate change. His investigative powers would be more limited if his party does not control the House, which is the outcome is anticipated right now. But, you know, people, even on the minority side of things, can still wield a lot of investigatory powers. So I think, unfortunately, he's another one to watch. Third congressperson, I'll just note who won election this year, Madison Cawthorn, who is a 24-year-old congressperson, the youngest one elected, new congressperson, who has also questioned to what extent humans are responsible for climate change. It's unclear what that means in regards to his action in Congress, but I think this goes to show that it's not just an issue involving older, more established members of Congress. Not to end on too much of a down note, I mean, obviously there's some very pro-science developments in this 2020 election, but there's still more work to be done. And again, I'll give it over to my colleague Augusta to discuss what scientists should be aware of in that regard.
Hi, everybody. My name is Augusta Wilson, and I am a lawyer with the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund. And I know you just saw a wonderful presentation from our executive director, Lauren Kurtz, talking about some really important ideas around congressional powers and how they have been used and misused in the science field and how they have affected scientists. And I'm going to pick up there on that really important point and jump off. It is, as I know Lauren told you, so crucial that scientists be involved in the political process and help to ensure that Congress in particular is scientifically literate as it makes legislation relating to crucial scientific issues. And so what I'm going to talk about is ways in which scientists can interact with their legislatures and be involved with that process. And in particular, a few limits that scientists should be aware of as they are doing that. And most importantly, I'm going to start by talking about anti-lobbying restrictions that scientists should be aware of. So when I say lobbying, I mean something fairly specific, which, as you can see here, is attempting to influence a politician with respect to a particular piece of legislation, either trying to influence a politician to adopt a particular piece of legislation, advance it, support it, or on the contrary, oppose it and prevent it from passing. And lobbying can also happen in relation to things that are not legislation, although legislation is the really traditional domain. But in some cases, other types of activity that legislators engage in, such as judicial nominations, for example, can sort of fall under that lobbying definition. And usually when we say lobbying, we mean something that's being done in a way that's going to benefit a particular organization, to influence that politician in a way that's going to benefit a particular organization's purposes. And there is one overarching and most important piece of legislation at the federal level that deals with lobbying, called the Anti-Lobbying Act. And what it does is it is fundamentally designed to prevent people or organizations from using government funds, federally appropriated, congressionally appropriated funds to lobby for their own political aims, and in particular, to prevent groups or individuals from using those funds to go seek more government funds, more congressionally appropriated funds. And there is sort of a potentially apocryphal, I'm not quite sure, tale about how this came to be, and especially how a portion of this law that's especially really relevant to scientists that I'm going to talk about a little bit more, called the Byrd Amendment, came to be. And the tale is that Representative Byrd found himself in a meeting with a lobbyist who was being paid through grant funds that Byrd had sort of helped bring home. And those funds were being used by this lobbyist to come to this meeting with Byrd and lobby him for more grant money. And so, according to this tale, he became pretty enraged when he realized that was the case. And out of that came about an amendment to the Anti-Lobbying Act called the Byrd Amendment. And what the Byrd Amendment does is to apply those principles that I just was mentioning, not using federally appropriated funds to seek more funds, applied that to federal grants, loans, and contracts. So it makes it illegal to use federal grant, loan, or contract money to seek an extension of a grant or contract, a new grant or contract, things like that. It's not supposed to use those kinds of funds to seek to influence a member of Congress in relation to those grants, loans, or contracts. And this can be very relevant for scientists because, as I'm sure you all know, many scientists, even those who do not work within the federal government, interact in one way or another in various parts of their work with federal grants. It's extremely common. And so these are principles that is really important for scientists at all kinds of institutions to be aware of if they interact with that kind of funding. So the general takeaway for scientists from the Anti-Lobbying Act and the Byrd Amendment, although what I was just discussing may sound a little bit, sort of intimidating or discouraging, the general takeaway is actually that there is a great deal that scientists who are employed by the federal government or who use federal grants or contract money can do in interacting with their legislators. There are some limits, but there really is a tremendous amount that scientists are absolutely free to do. So scientists can generally absolutely meet with a legislator to discuss general policy issues or to present a nonpartisan analysis. That is particularly true if the legislator has requested the meeting. And this is something that happens actually with some regularity. A member of Congress is working on a piece of legislation that relates to a specific scientific issue, and they want more information from a scientist with the relevant expertise in drafting the legislation or in deciding how to think about the legislation. And so they call up someone who has that expertise and say, would you come in and would you give me a presentation about what you know about this topic through your work? That kind of nonpartisan presentation, and especially if it's requested in that way, is not going to trigger any kinds of concerns under the Anti-Lobbying Act. And it's worth noting that the further you are in talking with your legislator from discussing the area of your federally funded work, the safer you are. So for example, if you are a geologist who feels really strongly about gun control legislation, and you wish to go speak to your legislator or interact in some way with your legislator and encourage them to take some action related to that in one way or another, you're very unlikely to be raising any anti-lobbying concerns because you're talking to them about something that's not connected to the area of your federally funded work, and there's there's going to be very little concern that there's some kind of issue there where you're seeking more funding for your work or trying to influence them in something relating to your funding or to your federally funded work. And it's also true that a scientist can meet with a legislator and do what absolutely is going to meet the definition of lobbying. You know, go to your legislator and talk to them about a particular legislative activity, try to get them to take a particular action, even in an area that relates to your federally funded work. As long as when you are doing that, you are not using any federal funds or resources to carry out that activity. So interactions you might have with the legislator on your own time and using your own resources are not going to violate the Anti-Lobbying Act if they are carried out without any federal funds or resources. So some general tips and best practices, and these are intended to be helpful for scientists at a whole range of institutions, everything from scientists who are directly employed by the federal government to scientists who are at academic research institutions, to scientists who are at state-owned institutions or privately owned institutions. These are pieces of advice that I think are helpful to all scientists in thinking about how to minimize the risk that any sort of activity you want to undertake where you are engaging with Congress, engaging with your legislators, advocating in some way, using your voice, are not going to have negative repercussions for you in your professional life. And the first one is sort of a repeat of what I just said, which goes to show how important I think it is. The single best piece of advice I can give is that if you are using your own funds and your own resources to engage in that activity, and you're doing it on your own time and not on your employer's time and not on time paid for by any kind of grant or anything like that, then that is absolutely the safest zone for minimizing the likelihood of triggering any kind of anti-lobbying problems. And one thing that it's worth mentioning briefly here, this can get a little bit complicated sometimes for scientists who are funded through a grant, to understand when are grant resources my personal resources and when are they not? And the rule of thumb is that once federal grant money, what I've learned from my experience is that in talking to scientists is that very often a grant is structured so that there's a certain portion of the awarded money that is kind of earmarked as salary. And that is salary that is received into the scientist's personal account eventually as personal salary. And the rule of thumb is that once that has happened, once those funds are received into your personal account as salary, they lose their identity as federal funds. And you no longer have to worry about them somehow being federal resources in terms of engaging in these kinds of advocacy activities. So that money that's been received by a scientist as salary, that scientist is perfectly free to use for some kind of advocacy activity, to contact a legislator, to write to a legislator or visit a legislator, things like that. So that's tip number one. Other things to keep in mind, it can be really helpful to take stock before you decide to engage in these kinds of activities of whether open records laws may apply to you. And there are many instances for many scientists in which open records laws do apply, including anyone who is a government employee, and also anyone who works at a publicly funded institution like a university. Open records laws can certainly be relevant, and it's definitely worth keeping in mind. Taking care to maintain in general a clear separation between the personal and the professional. And what I mean by that is, particularly in these COVID times when so many of us are working remotely so much more often than we used to, keeping to the extent you can, good records of hours when you are working and hours when you are not, so that you have good documentation and can be nice and clear about when you were on the job and when you were not, in terms of when you're going to choose to engage in advocacy activities and interacting with Congress. Keeping a nice separation between your personal and professional email and social media accounts to the extent possible, using professional accounts only for your professional work and correspondence, and keeping the personal stuff in personal accounts can be very, very helpful. Making sure to not use government equipment for these kinds of activities. Talked a lot about making sure to use your own funds and resources, and that certainly does extend to equipment, computers, phones, printers, things like that, that maybe were purchased with federal grant money or in some other way using federal resources. Good practice to make sure that those kinds of things are used only for the activities they're intended for, not for these kinds of personal advocacy activities, engaging with legislators and things like that. And this one may seem a little bit goes without saying, but it can be very helpful if you want to, as a citizen, interact with a member of Congress or participate in any other kind of advocacy activity, like attending a rally or giving an interview, anything like that, to consider not wearing clothing or insignia or logos that identify your employer, your agency, your university, your lab, whatever it might be. This will help you to again maintain that clear line that you are speaking as a private citizen and in your personal capacity, and not on behalf of your employer, which is sort of, again, the safest possible zone to be in terms of making sure not to trigger some of these anti-lobbying type concerns. So along those lines, I'm considering using disclaimers and being clear that you're speaking in your personal capacity. If you are going to do something like have a meeting with a legislator or write an open letter, can be very, very helpful, again, in terms of maintaining that distinction. And one of the things I know that scientists frequently run into is, well, I want to write a letter or sign on to this petition or give testimony or give an interview, whatever it might be. And I do want to do it as a citizen, but my expertise and my affiliation with my institution are very relevant, because they are the reason why people should give weight to the opinion that I'm giving or to the statement that I'm making. And so I do want to be able to tell people what that expertise and training and affiliation is. And I completely understand that conflict. That's a place where it can be really helpful to say something like, affiliation is for identification purposes only. I've seen scientists do that in signing an open letter. And that kind of disclaimer can help you strike that balance between making sure that your statement is given appropriate weight and also making it clear that you're not speaking on behalf of your employer. And that can be helpful if you're trying to minimize the risk of any negative blowback. And finally, it can be really useful just to take some time to make sure that you understand your institution's policies around political speech. Chances are good that your institution, whatever it is, has some policies along those lines, and taking some time to review them and make sure you understand them is very wise. And I will take a moment here to make a quick plug, with which Lauren may already have made in her portion, but that is exactly the kind of question that we at CSLDF are very happy to help scientists work through. We offer completely free and completely confidential confidential consultations to scientists. And so anyone who has a particular question, I'm trying to understand my specific institution's policies, I'm considering engaging in X activity and I want to make sure that it's okay, please do feel free to reach out to us. And we'll be very happy to, to talk people through any specific situation or answer any specific questions. And I'll put up contact information at the end of the presentation, and it's also pretty easy to find online. So a couple tips about how to respond if, despite best efforts, you have been engaging in some advocacy activity, using your voice to interact with members of Congress or do some other political activity like that, and you are somehow targeted as a result. There is negative blowback. A few tips on that front. The first is that institutional counsel of, again, whatever institution it might be, agency counsel, if you are a scientist who works at a federal agency, university counsel, if you're at a university, almost any institution is going to have their own lawyers. And those lawyers can be a wonderful resource. I have seen situations in which they were very helpful to scientists who were facing some kind of targeting. But that said, it is key to remember that those institutional counsel are not your lawyers. They represent the institution and not you, and they will represent the institution's interests. And if your interests diverge from those of the institution, then that can be a problem. It's not always the case, but sometimes it is. So it's certainly something that's very important to keep in mind before engaging with institutional counsel and while engaging with them. If you are facing retaliation from inside your organization in one way or another, internal demotions or censoring or disciplinary action of some kind, whatever it might be, the first thing to do is to take stock of what internal channels exist for you to raise complaints about what's happening and to understand the implications of using them for your professional future. And again, that is something that we at CSLDF are very happy to help individual scientists think through and happy to advise on for those who may be facing a specific question, because it can vary widely depending on exactly which institution you're with and what their what those internal chains of command are. If what you're experiencing is some kind of external targeting coming from outside your organization, the first piece of advice, and I know it's not always the one that people want most to hear, but it is true that in a lot of situations, if you're receiving hostile messages, hate mail, vicious emails from some kind of external source, it's often true that the best thing to do is to simply ignore them. That said, there are categories of things that should never be ignored. So if you have received something along the lines of a subpoena, or notice that you're the subject of a congressional inquiry or a records request, and certainly if you are receiving physically threatening messages, that's a list of things that should absolutely never be ignored. And please do contact us at CSLDF or another lawyer right away if any of those things are going on. So I wanted to take just a minute before I close to mention that some of the information that I've gone through in this presentation is also available in written form in a variety of resources that we at CSLDF have come out with and that are available on our website. And so I've put up screenshots of a few of them here, guides to help you navigate political harassment, guidelines for engaging in advocacy, and in particular, a new resource that's going to deal with congressional oversight powers and how they have intersected with science and in many cases harmed science. So a lot of useful information in those, and please do feel free to head to our website and download any that seem useful. And last but not least, this is contact information. My email is there on the bottom, awilson@csldf.org, and please do not hesitate to reach out if you have a specific question. And I thank everyone for watching and would be very glad to receive any questions by phone or email. Thank you again. Great. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending and watching this session. I am, as you just saw, I'm Augusta Wilson. I'm an attorney with CSLDF, and I'm here with our executive director, Lauren Kurtz, who you saw earlier in the presentation. And we are very pleased to be here to take some of your questions about the presentation. And I will just dive in. The first question that we have is, to what extent is the skepticism of lawmakers regarding climate change a confusion about the science itself versus opposition to extreme climate alarmism or advocacy for certain partisan responses to climate change? And I first want to say, Lauren, you may well have some thoughts in response to that question, which we'd all love to hear.
Sure. It's a complicated question, but I would say it's a range. I do think that some lawmakers want to be educated and are coming from a place of curiosity, and they don't necessarily have a science background, and they really benefit from being educated by people like AGU members. I think, unfortunately, there are other Congress people who consciously or subconsciously are really disputing the science because it in some ways challenges their other beliefs, whether that be, the importance of the energy sector or something else. And we've really seen a range of that in Congress. I know I mentioned a few examples in my talk. The incidences that I reference, I am not so sure that those Congress people had good faith beliefs behind challenging the science, but I suppose it's possible. And there are other instances where, Congress people who have come out one way on something have later been educated and corrected their vision. So I think it's always worth trying and assuming good faith, but it really can be a range for an individual congressperson.
Yeah, absolutely. One thought that it prompts for me, just to add to that a little bit, is I have learned a great deal in my time at CSLDF about really long-standing efforts on the part of industry and special interest groups, frankly, to create a great deal of doubt among the general public, but also with lawmakers about the science of climate change. Really sort of a deliberate effort to create the impression that there is a lack of consensus or that there's uncertainty on issues where there is absolutely a consensus and there's very little, if any, uncertainty. So I think that's another, it just comes to mind as another factor that I think affects lawmakers just as much as it does members of the general public. People who have unfortunately an impression that there are questions where there actually aren't.
I will read out the next question, which is, how can reform measures you suggested be enacted, and how can we as scientists do anything to make that happen? So my colleague Augusta, talked about how scientists can engage with Congress people. I think that's really an effective way for scientists to make their voices heard by Congress, is directly contacting your congressperson. But there's other things as well. I mean, one of the things that I think is important to be aware of is just, calling out bad behavior is important. And I think making clear when a congressperson does something unscientific, that it is publicly noted and that it is not left to pass. It's, something that we've really seen over the last 4 years is the power in people speaking up when things happen. It doesn't obviously correct all issues, but I do think it's a really important role. So you don't need to necessarily work directly with Congress if that's something that you're uncomfortable or unable to do. You can also play a role in just speaking up when you see something, or being a part of conversations that, discuss what's happening. It's not necessarily direct action is necessary, but I think that is also a very helpful way. Again, my colleague Augusta talked about issues that scientists who do want to, directly contact their congressperson, what they can do. And your congressperson, may be somebody who you feel very aligned with, or it may not be. I think both sorts of contact can be helpful, either promoting ideas that you think will be received receptively by your congressperson, or challenging them when you think that they've done something inappropriate or unscientific.
Yeah, I always love the work that many in the audience may be familiar with Katharine Hayhoe, who is a terrific climate science scientist and science communicator. And Lauren, you just made me think of one of the things that I think she says often, which is one of the most important things we can do is simply to talk about it. And I think that's absolutely true.
I think that actually segues nicely into the next question. So I'll answer too, but I'll give you the first crack at it, Augusta. What are the best ways for scientists to speak up, as you said, when they see something unscientific?
Yeah, I mean, and it's a terrific question, and I'm afraid I'm probably going to go back here to some of what I was touching on in the actual body of the presentation. I think there are a range of avenues, and the best thing to do obviously is very context dependent and can depend hugely on exactly what's going on for that particular scientist, where they are, and what their needs and priorities are. But I think often some of the most effective ways to address a situation such as this, where a scientist sees something happening, I'm kind of taking from the implication of the question that we're talking about something happening in that scientist's workplace, among that scientist's colleagues. And very often, I think, some of the most effective things scientists can do actually are internal to the organization. So conferring with trusted colleagues and gauging whether others react to the situation in the same way, and using internal channels, raising awareness, sort of going up the chain inside your own organization, can be a really effective and important way to address some kind of scientific integrity violation or unscientific behavior that a scientist is witnessing. That doesn't always work, unfortunately. Again, as I said, it can be very effective, but I've also seen plenty of situations where scientists were not finding that those within their organization were very receptive or handling such a situation very well. And so in that case, I think often scientists think about external channels. I have found that using media channels, finding ways to draw public attention to a situation, if that's something that a scientist is willing to do, and comfortable doing can also be a very effective way of raising awareness about some kind of scientific integrity violation or unscientific behavior, and ensuring that it gets addressed. And Lauren, please, add additional thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you said. There are internal channels, depending on, if it's an internal issue, if it's something that you see with your congressperson, external can be really valuable. Augusta obviously talked about the difference between, separating your personal and professional roles, which I think is very true with that. But you can do things like write things on social media, write an op-ed, talk with friends and family. You can also do things like join open letters. Those get circulated. Again, please, if you use, say, your title, make sure that you have a disclaimer that you're not speaking on behalf of your institution unless you are, in fact, speaking on behalf of your institution. There's also, I think the last 4 years have seen a real increase in things like public protests and demonstrations. For this, I will put a plug for the event we're having next Monday at 9 a.m. Augusta will be presenting again with an attorney from the ACLU, which will talk about the First Amendment considerations for scientists who want to do things like speak out against unscientific issues.
Great.
Should we take the next question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Sorry, wasn't sure if AG wanted to mention any of their AGU events. I'm not aware of the exact schedule, but I know that AGU also has a number of events for scientists who want to become more engaged in advocacy and political issues. In any case, next question, what do you think is the easiest / safest way to start out in advocacy? I would say joining group efforts in some ways is a little safer, not always. I mean, if the group is taking a direction that is challenging, for example, some group efforts where people did not appropriately identify that they were speaking on their own behalf and not on behalf of the institution, those have gone sideways. But I would say that there is safety in numbers, and that a collective group of people are usually able to troubleshoot a little more safely than an individual just acting alone on Twitter. But that's not always true. I think, as Augusta mentioned before, figuring out who your trusted colleagues are and coordinating with them. I mean, it really depends on the issue. Are you trying to face something that's small and local, or are you trying to face something that's large and national? Because that's obviously a very different set of risk calculations and scenarios. As Augusta and I have both noted before, that people can always contact us with questions. If you email us at lawyer@CSLDF, it'll go to all the lawyers on the team, and someone will try to get back to you if you want to talk about your particular situation or actions that you're considering taking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, my thoughts are very much the same. I think my overarching response to that question would be, you're probably safer acting in a group than just sort of going out on your own, as exactly as Lauren said. And I guess I would add that probably the more distance such a group has from your workplace, whatever that might be, the less likely any negative repercussions would be. Yeah. Should I jump into the next one? We have one more question here, which is, if I'm being discouraged from engaging in advocacy by my employer or lab or other institution, what should I do? And this is a question that we regrettably get relatively frequently. This is certainly something that scientists encounter. And the first thing I would say is that this requires sort of taking a measure of exactly how much risk you personally are willing to take on. You know, a scientist in that situation, I would say the first steps would be to really evaluate what your rights are, in fact. You know, what are sort of the bounds in terms of First Amendment rights, for example, that allow you to engage in advocacy and speak out and use your voice, regardless of what your employer might be telling you or you know, encouraging you to do. And that can really vary depending on who your employer is. So taking those sort of measures, understanding those boundaries, understanding what your employer's policies actually are regarding that kind of activity and that kind of action is the first place to start. And then the next question that this scientist has to sort of evaluate for themselves is, okay, how far am I willing to go in pushing those policies and understanding what they are? How far am I willing to go in taking the risk that my employer is going to be unhappy, whether or not I'm violating a policy or whether or not I'm within my legal rights, and what's comfortable for me? And then deciding, you know, what are your priorities, and, you know, where's that balance for you? I think it's a very personal decision.
I agree. I have nothing to add, so I'll make sure we can get to the next question, which is, some can argue that scientists voicing their political opinions has led to increased politicization of science. And I do think this is a major problem. How can we keep this in mind while still expressing our views? Well, I'll start by saying I think there's two separate issues here. One is we've talked largely here about scientists speaking out against unscientific views, not necessarily political views. So I would argue that scientists speaking out about scientific issues, while they may have been affected by and interact with political issues, is actually different. And I think the classic example is often, you know, a climate scientist who is speaking about the importance of taking action on climate change is speaking on a more scientific side of things, whereas a scientist who speaks about the merits of a carbon tax versus cap and trade is getting into more political issues, you know, not necessarily something they have personal expertise in, but they're certainly entitled to their own political views. That is obviously a little bit more challenging. Some scientists think that it is still valid for them to voice their opinions on this. Some think that that's getting a little too far afield. I think both perspectives are actually useful, but maybe that's a helpful way to think about it. I mean, in general, I think that increased politicization is sort of the name of the game these days. And I'm not sure that scientists, rightly or wrongly, can take a lot of blame for the current state of affairs. That's just my 2 cents. So I think scientists recognizing that that's the world that we live in now and engaging at that level is not really making it worse. But I also recognize that there are other perspectives to this, and scientists who would like to be a little bit more circumspect. I mean, I certainly respect that point of view as well. Augusta, sadly, I think you're on mute.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I think you said it all there. I think science has always, to some degree, been inherently political, and there's inevitably an overlap between, you know, between scientific issues and political issues, but science-based policy is the goal. I think
well, it looks like
just out of time here. Yeah, Lauren, do you have any concluding thoughts or?
Yeah, I'll just put in another plug. You know, people who have more questions can always email us at lawyer@csldf.org, or you can come to our website, csldf.org, and we have a contact form that works as well. And anyone who comes up with more questions or wants to talk about their particular situation is very much encouraged to reach out to us. So thank you all for attending and asking great questions.
Thank you, everybody.